This video goes along with your photosynthesis notes. To start, we are going to look at an overview of photosynthesis. Starting with the chemical reaction. The chemical reaction for photosynthesis is 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O yields C6 H12 O6 plus 6O2. Everything on the left-hand side, so the carbon dioxide and water, are called the reactants, or what you're starting with, and everything on the right are the products, or your end result. What this means is that during photosynthesis, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of H2O with light energy make 1 molecule of C6H12O6, which is glucose, and 6 molecules of oxygen. So things like plants or photosynthetic algae use carbon dioxide, water, and light energy to make glucose and oxygen. The location of photosynthesis is the chloroplast, which is an organelle that is found in plant cells. Inside the chloroplast, there is a special pigment that is called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a green pigment in chloroplast that absorbs light. This is why the leaves on trees appear to be green. It's because they have lots and lots of chlorophyll in the leaves, which is where photosynthesis is taking place. Next, we are going to draw a diagram of a chloroplast. So we'll start here. This is our chloroplast. This is called the outer membrane. Since there is an outer membrane, we know chloroplast must also have an inner membrane. Chloroplasts and mitochondria also have 2 membranes because they used to be their own sufficient things and then were consumed by a pre-eukaryotic cell and ended up staying there because they were so useful. And that's called the theory of endosymbiosis. And that's, again, what tells us how chloroplasts and mitochondria got into a cell. Anyway, so we have our outer membrane and inner membrane. There's a fluid on the inside that is called the stroma. And then we have, the real star of photosynthesis over here. These little stacks of discs. An individual disc is called a thylakoid. So one disc here is a thylakoid. And a, stack of discs is called a granum. The plural form of that is grana. And then on our thylakoid membrane is where we have chlorophyll. So all of these things will be important as we move through photosynthesis, which we will finally get to. This is probably the extent of what you've known about photosynthesis up to now. And the reality is that it doesn't just happen in one fell swoop. It happens in two very different and distinct steps. The first step of photosynthesis is called the light reaction. It's also sometimes called the light-dependent reaction because it requires light for it to happen. Without light energy, this reaction cannot happen. The second step is called the Calvin cycle. Calvin is always capitalized because it's named after a person. This can also be called the light-independent reaction because it does not require the input of light for the reaction to occur. There are two other things that we need for photosynthesis to occur. They're not part of the reaction because they are used up, and so we're not, they're used up and recycled. So one of them is called NADP. It stands for a super long thing that we don't care for you to know. And essentially what happens is when we are using carbon dioxide and water to make glucose, we have to shift some electrons around. And electrons floating by themselves are really unstable, and so they need to be attached to something, and that something is called NADP, which we'll get to in a second. So it is called an electron carrier. And when it has an electron attached to it, it is NADPH. So this hydrogen electron will get ripped off of the water molecule and attached to this so that it can be used to make glucose later. But we'll get there. We also need a little bit of energy. So to make energy, we need ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, plus a phosphorus to make ATP. But again, we're going to make and use energy a couple times throughout this process. So we need some electron carriers and a little bit of energy to help push the process of photosynthesis. We will now go through the two steps in a medium light detail, starting with the light reaction because it has to happen first. Starting with what happens. In general, during the light reaction, light is absorbed and water is split. So we're using that energy from the light to split H2O into oxygen and hydrogen electrons. The more specific location of this process is on the thylakoid. So that's where the chlorophyll is that will be able to absorb the light. And so the light reaction happens on the thylakoid. During the light reaction, we are going to use water, light energy, we're going to use NADP to take on the electrons from the water, and we're going to use ADP because we need to make a little bit of energy. And with those four things during the light reaction, we're going to make oxygen gas, or O2, NADPH. So that's where those hydrogens from the water are now, for now. And we're going to make a little bit of ATP energy. happens to these things is some O2 will be released to the atmosphere, and then some is kept for respiration, which we'll talk about next time. And then the NADPH and ATP are sent to be used in the Calvin cycle. So all we're doing is shifting these atoms around, and to do that, NADPH will carry the hydrogen electron to where it needs to be so that it can be used to make glucose here in a second. So that is all for the light reaction. After this, we have the Calvin cycle. During the Calvin cycle, what happens? In a long, drawn-out process that is cyclic, I mean, that's why it's called the Calvin cycle, we make glucose. Glucose is the goal. Like, this is what we're trying to make, not we, plants. Plants are trying to make glucose during photosynthesis because they cannot consume their food, so they have to make it. This is the main thing. All the other stuff just has to happen so we can get to our main event. The location of the Calvin cycle is the stroma of the chloroplast. And remember, that's the fluid or liquidy thing that is inside the chloroplast. We are going to use CO2, carbon dioxide, and then we're going to also use NADPH and ATP that were made during the light reaction. And with that, we make C6H12O6, which is glucose. And we also will make, because it's been used, NADP and ADP. These two things right here go back to the light reaction. So cells are really good at using and reusing and recycling things. So after those electrons and that energy has been spent, those two molecules end up going back so that they can pick up more electrons, or and be turned back into ATP. So when we talk about what happens to these molecules, those get sent back, and one of two things is going to happen to the glucose. Some glucose gets used in respiration, which again we'll talk about next time, and some glucose gets used for cell structures. So in the case of plants, cellulose is part of their cell wall, and that's made up of long chains of glucoses. So it's not just about making something that they can use to make energy later. It's also about being able to have some cellular supports later. Two final thoughts on this is that the purpose of photosynthesis is to make glucose. Oxygen is a byproduct. Oxygen is useful for both plants and also for animals, but that's not the main purpose, right? There's already plenty of oxygen in our atmosphere. We want to make the glucose. Oxygen is just like a bonus thing that was not the real intention. There are two, well, I guess more than that, but let's think about two things that can change the rate of photosynthesis. So you may notice that the leaves have already started to change into their lovely reds and yellows and everything in between. And that is for a couple of different reasons, some of which you will explore in your activity this week. But things that can impact the rate of photosynthesis are available sunlight, and maybe even the intensity. So we have less photosynthesis occurring now because, one, the number of hours of daylight is shorter, and because of the shift in the Earth's rotation, we're not getting as much direct sunlight. And then available water. In lots of parts of our world, fall and winters when we have a decrease in the amount of precipitation. And so we're not going to have as much photosynthesis because, if you recall, both water and sunlight are required for photosynthesis. Sorry this was a little longer than I intended, but I hope it was helpful, and I'll see you soon.